Hello everyone, this is Darcinovia here, and this is my video on the 30th anniversary of the Thrawn trilogy. This is not a review of the novels or the comic book adaptation. This is a look back at possibly one of the most well-known Star Wars, expanded universe stories of all time. Arguably, the trilogy that put Star Wars back on the map before there was new movies being made, and the original sequel trilogy. Heir to Empire was published in 1991. 30 years ago, a universe was born. For almost a decade, the events of Return of the Jedi, people were craving for more stories, more adventures with their favorite characters. They wanted to see how the story would have continued past the events of Return of the Jedi. There were comics for a few years that did continue the adventures of Luke, Han, and Leia, but that run ended 6 years prior to this book being published. And Star Wars was pretty dry in content for half a decade. It was West End Games, which was one of the first new content released after these comics, that basically kept Star Wars alive before Heir to Empire was published. Now, anybody that knows anything about Star Wars, people, when you think of Star Wars creators, people mostly think George Lucas. But when people, expanded universe fans, when they think of Star Wars authors, Timothy Zahn is the first one to come up, because Timothy Zahn, with his Thrawn trilogy, launched a new era of Star Wars storytelling. Heir to Empire would start a storyline that would continue for 22 years. And many, many books would come after this book that would continue the stories of Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, and Leia Organa. And eventually their children, their grandchildren, and their descendants. You'd have many stories featuring, these characters. Even though this trilogy is no longer considered canon, it is one of the most important pieces of Star Wars history. Because the Thrawn trilogy first introduced the planet Coruscant, which was, I can't even pronounce what they used to call it. I can't even pronounce it. I know they used to pronounce it differently in the audiobooks that were published at the time. It wasn't until The Phantom Menace where, the planet was officially called Coruscant. This, novel also introduced many concepts that would carry over for the rest of the lifespan of the expanded universe. It also basically set everything up that would carry over for 22 years. This also introduced one of the most iconic Star Wars villains, the only ones, that eclipse this one, is Darth Vader and Thrawn and Darth Sidious. Thrawn. Now, Thrawn, back in the 1990s, did have the amount of stories that he did compared to what he has now. As of this recording, the second book in the Ascendancy trilogy came out. Thrawn is arguably one of the most popular Star Wars characters, and for good reason. He's interesting, he's mysterious, and he was modeled, after many, generals in history. And his way of studying the tactics of his enemies was unique among Star Wars villains. This Thrawn that we would get in this trilogy came the closest to destroying the New Republic out of any of the villains before the Yuuzhan Vong. The Thrawn trilogy, on its own, is a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It could be your first expanded universe novel and your last. Well, novels, whatever. I read these books originally back in 2011, and I was blown away by the Thrawn trilogy. I was blown away by the story, by the character development of the OT, and how I could feel like I can hear the voices of the actors, of the characters in my head as I'm reading the novel. This book, many things could have gone wrong. Star Wars is hardly the first franchise to have an expanded universe, and it's hardly the first franchise to have an influential novel. Star Trek has some novels that influence the various Star Trek episodes, and Star Wars has various novels that had influence, multiple Star Wars, sources. Thrawn would eventually be brought into Star Wars Rebels and possibly a future TV series on Disney Plus. But another character that I argue who is probably one of the most well-developed characters in the expanded universe is Guild Pellaeon. Guild Pellaeon is a great character. And one of the tragedies of the decanonization of the Thrawn trilogy is canon loses such a great character. Because Pellaeon is dead, according to Rebels, what I know of Rebels. And that's a tragedy, because Thrawn without Pellaeon just doesn't feel right to me. Pellaeon I think is a great character. I think he had one of the best arcs of all of the side characters in the whole expanded universe. I think the introduction of Talon Karrde, another interesting character. He doesn't have that many appearances in the EU, but he's fascinating. He's the smuggler that's introduced at the very beginning of the novel. And how can I forget arguably the most popular character from the Star Wars expanded universe, other than Revan, Mara Jade, the future wife of Luke Skywalker. Now, Mara Jade isn't defined because she's Luke Skywalker's future wife. This trilogy, she's a great character in her own right. She goes through her own arc of the trilogy. And I think it was brilliant. And I felt it was a really good storyline for the character. And I know some people may think the idea of Luke ending up with Mara may be dumb, but whatever. This is Star Wars. I mean, come on. You're really going to complain about someone that wanted to kill Luke at one point marrying him when you have some cringy dialogue with Han, Anakin, and Padme? Come on. It's a fucking Skywalker tradition. All right, let's just fucking say it how it is. So I'm not going to, say, what it isn't. This is Star Wars. Of course you're going to have weird relationships for the Skywalkers. It's a tradition of the Skywalker family. It wouldn't be Star Wars if you didn't have some dysfunction. This novel would also introduce concepts that, fans would not like, especially those who shit on the EU. Like cloning. Like force-resistant creatures in the galaxy. Or hints of a threat that is beyond the galaxy that the characters reside in. this book, at least Heir to Empire, gave hints of what could be and what will be to come. Now, I don't think Timothy Zahn, knew in advance that this would explode into like a multi-book, series that would like span 22 years. This novel, along with the ones that came after it, was made to be a trilogy. Of course, Heir to Empire was a success. I mean, literally, the first edition hardcover was literally sold out, and they had to reprint them. In fact, they sold the first wave of the hardcovers for a loss because they didn't expect there to be any demand for Star Wars content, but there was. And as a result of that, each of the books that would come after, people would have to wait a year in between books. Now, the Thrawn trilogy, for me, I don't consider it episode 7, 8, and 9. Because honestly, I just view it as one, story. It's just one part of it. Now, I do enjoy the Thrawn trilogy. I will admit, I've only read it once. I've listened to it on Audible like 2 times because, well, Mark Thompson, I think, does a great job bringing the characters to life. I think Mark Thompson did a great job doing the voice for Thrawn, and I actually prefer how he does Thrawn in the Thrawn trilogy, the original, over how he does Thrawn in the new canon. I just think Thrawn's voice that he used in the original Thrawn trilogy actually fit the character more than his current voice. I understand he's trying to match how Thrawn sounds like in Rebels, but I think he just sounds better in the original Thrawn trilogy. Then again, this is audiobook. It's not related to, the book itself. Eventually, the Thrawn trilogy would have a comic book adaptation. Mind you, not many expanded universe novels got the adaptation treatment. Shadows of the Empire got it. The first of the Brian Daley Han Solo novels got it. And there might be a few others, I don't know, but not many books in the expanded universe got the adaptation treatment. Now, I may review the comic book adaptation of the Thrawn trilogy at another time, so I'm not going to give you my thoughts of it. But the one thing I do know from it, it does add some references to the prequels. Padme Amidala, I don't know if you guys knew this, made her first appearance not in the Phantom Menace, but actually in the Thrawn trilogy, the comic book adaptation. Now, that is something. It was obvious back then were giving hints that Padme Amidala was related to the Skywalker children and the Solo twins, which is another notable thing about the Thrawn trilogy. The grandchildren of Darth Vader, Jason and Jaina Solo, are born in the Thrawn trilogy. And however you feel about how those characters' storylines turned out is a different discussion for a different video. But many of the things that Star Wars fans would grow to love about the expanded universe or hate, depending on who you talk to, was introduced in the Thrawn trilogy. Now, being 30 years old, how does it hold up? In my opinion, I think the Thrawn trilogy has held up pretty well. And I think anybody that says it hasn't read it. Yes, it was published in the 1990s, and was written in the late 1980s. But a good story is a good story, regardless when it was published. And when you compare it to a lot of books that had tie-ins, to other franchises, I argue the Thrawn trilogy has held up better than many of the old Star Trek novels. The Thrawn trilogy felt like a legitimate sequel to the original trilogy. It actually felt like this was the next story of the Skywalker saga. This feels like this was actually the continuation of their storyline. And the Thrawn trilogy, they could have just done the original trilogy all over again in novel form with a new coat of paint, and it could have been one of those forgettable, tie-in sequels to a franchise that already ended, but it didn't do that. Timothy Zahn took the original characters, aged them up 5 years, gave us a new villain in the form of a Grand Admiral, and who could forget Julius Sabaoth, the psychopathic Jedi clone of the original Julius Sabaoth, which we would know nothing about until the novel Outbound Flight. And honestly, the novel's greatest strength is how well it stands on its own. All you need to do is watch the original trilogy and then read the Thrawn trilogy. And another good thing about this book is it's so easy to find. It's been reprinted so many damn times that it's the easiest Star Wars book to find. I mean, whatever edition you want, whether it's a old paperback or a new Legends reprint or a unabridged audiobook, there's multiple ways you can enjoy the Thrawn trilogy. The Thrawn trilogy could have easily had been one of those forgotten stories that would have been tied to a franchise. It could have easily been one of those forgotten Star Trek novels that nobody cares about these days, and it would be one of those obscure things. It could have easily had been that way, but it isn't. The Thrawn trilogy is one of the most cited Star Wars stories outside the films. You cannot name one website that hasn't referenced the Thrawn trilogy when they talk about Star Wars books at some point. When you look at top 10 best Star Wars novels of all time, the Thrawn trilogy is almost always on the list. Best legend stories, best Star Wars books. The Thrawn trilogy is up there in many lists for best Star Wars stories of all time. And for good reason. It continued the story past Return of the Jedi. It introduced a great villain. It has the feel of the original trilogy. The characters, it feels like the author who wrote it actually knew the characters, and the characters felt like themselves. It felt like there was a lot of passion put into this book. It just, the Thrawn trilogy is just something that it may sound biased, but I consider the Thrawn trilogy a great story. And I think if you have yet to check out the Thrawn trilogy, you should. There's so many different ways you could experience this trilogy at this point. This is not a review. The impact on the Star Wars franchise cannot be denied. I mean, Thrawn is in Rebels. Thrawn has 2 trilogies in canon. The character of Thrawn is the reason why we have the Chiss, one of the most interesting Star Wars species in the entire franchise. You would not have that without the Thrawn trilogy. You would not have many of the things that were established in the Star Wars expanded universe without the Thrawn trilogy. Many of the things that canon currently has would not exist without the Thrawn trilogy. The Thrawn trilogy effect on the franchise is undeniable. If you actually think the Thrawn trilogy, is not important to Star Wars, you're fooling yourself. The only thing more important in the Thrawn trilogy is the original trilogy itself. Because the Thrawn trilogy revitalized Star Wars in the 90s. It proved there was a market for future Star Wars material. It showed that the interest was still there. If it weren't for the Thrawn trilogy, Star Wars would have just been a trilogy of films. I mean, the Thrawn trilogy started the longest continuing book series based on a film. Star Wars on a Guinness Book of World Records for longest, book series based off a movie. That is what this trilogy started. 22 years of stories started here. Now, does it mean the Thrawn trilogy is perfect? No. I mean, I think, the Luke clone is a stupid idea. And I think the Thrawn trilogy gets, is used to shit on the EU when people say it's the only good book series of the entire EU, even though that's a fallacy. I think the trilogy is a little overrated when you compare it to other future stuff that would come afterwards. I think the Thrawn trilogy is a great story, but I think people overpraise it, and those who praise the Thrawn trilogy, most of them have never read it. And that's where I stand on it anyway. 30 years later, the Thrawn trilogy is still a good Star Wars story. And even if you have only read canon, I would suggest you actually check these books out. If you're disappointed with the sequel trilogy, I would check these books out. Who knows? You might get a better story than you ultimately got. This is Darth Sinovia. Over and out. May the Force be with you. And see you guys next time with another video.